White is often considered to have the potential for an opening advantage thanks to being able to move first, and certainly there are several ways to challenge black's defenses. Occupying the center with e4 or d4, as well as the English with c4, or the flexible knight f3 are all serious attempts to play for an opening advantage. If white has no interest in trying to prove an opening advantage, it's also possible for white to play less common, irregular flank openings that do not prioritize central control and rapid development as much as the more mainline choices. These attempts often try to avoid serious opening theory and may be used as a surprise weapon to catch an inexperienced opponent off guard. We're going to introduce some of white's more reasonable, as well as mention less reasonable ways to open the game with irregular flank openings. Moving the rook pawns with a4 and h4 are often associated with beginner's play. These moves do nothing to promote healthy development and good central control. In response, black may simply rely on general opening principles to obtain a good game, including occupying the center with pawns, as well as focusing on rapid development to help control the center. Instead of advancing the rook pawns forward 2 squares, white may consider an inoffensive move such as a3, known as Anderson's opening. Unlike some of the more radical flank openings, this does not seriously harm white's position, nor does it challenge black's. As black, it's important to decide what sort of reversed opening you may feel comfortable playing. For example, if black plays the sensible e5, then white may continue with c4, turning the game into the English opening in which white's play resembles a Sicilian defense with colors reversed. It's also possible to play the solid d5, when after d4, we've entered queen's pawn territory in which white is committed to the somewhat harmless a3 move. One of white's most questionable opening choices is g4, turning the game into the Grob's opening. It's easy to imagine that white's position would actually be better off simply skipping a move, rather than committing to this anti-positional pawn lunge. d5, revealing the light-squared bishop's attack against the unprotected g4 pawn, is one solid option. And another excellent alternative is claiming central space with e5, when white will be hard-pressed to justify this dubious opening decision. Instead of lunging the g-pawn forward 2 squares, seriously compromising white's position, a far more respectable choice is to advance the g-pawn 1 square forward, preparing a solid kingside fianchetto with bishop g2. This is often just another way to enter more popular opening lines. On the other hand, if white refuses to claim central space, black should not be afraid to place 2 pawns in the center and fight for an advantage. If black responds with e5 or c5, then white may transpose into the English opening with c4. And if black decides to claim central space with d5, white is able to play knight f3, transposing into ready or King's Indian attack positions. On the other side of the board, it's possible to play b4, known as the Polish or orangutan opening. d5 is one solid way to handle this opening, and black may also play e5, claiming central space while attacking the b4 pawn. If white defends the pawn with a3, then black should be happy to claim more central space with d5. White's most dynamic option is to counterattack black's center with bishop b2. It's possible to defend the e5 pawn with d6, but black should avoid the mechanical knight c6, defending the e5 pawn, as the orangutan pawn can march forward with b5, attacking the knight, forcing it to abandon the defense of the e5 pawn. The most popular continuation is exchanging pawns with bishop takes b4, allowing bishop takes e5. At first glance, this appears to be a strange decision, as white has captured black's central e-pawn in exchange for a less important flank pawn on the b-file. The drawback to this approach is that white accepts a compromised pawn structure, as white's a-pawn is isolated from its fellow pawns, meaning this pawn can only be protected by pieces. It's important for black not to forget that white's dark-squared bishop is attacking the g7 pawn. So a strong reply is knight f6. Black is prepared to castle and eventually gain time against the dark-squared bishop with either knight c6 or rook e8. It's important to recognize the Polish opening is certainly playable, so black should not expect a quick win against an experienced and creative player. On the other hand, white should not expect any opening advantage and must play accurately to avoid an unpleasant position. Instead of moving the pawn to the unprotected b4 square, allowing it to be attacked after e5, white may decide to advance the b-pawn forward only 1 square. This is known as Larsen's opening, named after the creative Danish grandmaster Bent Larsen. b3 is one of white's more respected flank openings, preparing to fight for central control with bishop b2. One sensible choice is d5, often turning the game into reverse queen-pawn territory, especially if black continues with c5. In this case, we may see a Nimzo or Queen's Indian position with colors reversed. If black wants to challenge the scope of white's dark-squared bishop, a principled reply is e5. White may decide to turn the game into English territory with c4, but the traditional Larsen's move is bishop b2, challenging the central e5 pawn. Defending this pawn with d6 is one option, but a more flexible response is knight c6, supporting the e5 pawn while preserving the option of playing d5 on the next move. White may decide to discourage this idea with c4, or play in Larsen style with e3. Knight f6 is a flexible option worth exploring, but if black wants to try and maximize a central space advantage, then we may see d5. Just like when facing less respectable flank options, black is focusing on occupying as much central space as possible while promoting straightforward development. Against the Larsen's opening, however, black cannot simply rely on general opening principles and expect a good game, as white is prepared to play the challenging bishop b5, pinning the knight on c6, so e5 is suddenly hanging. We see an instructive clash of ideas in which black directly occupies the center with pawns, while white energetically counterattacks the center with piece play from the flanks. In one Grandmaster encounter, Hikaru Nakamura played bishop d6, defending the e5 pawn, but now the g7 pawn is no longer protected. White may consider increasing the central tension with moves such as knight f3 or c4. But his opponent, Grandmaster Badur Jabava, decided to play the more double-edged option, f4, intensifying the struggle over the e5 square at the expense of weakening the e1 to h4 diagonal. Since capturing the pawn would allow bishop takes g7, black should focus on reinforcing the e5 pawn. Before directly defending the center, Grandmaster Nakamura provoked additional kingside weaknesses with queen h4 check, exploiting the newly opened e1 to h4 diagonal, preparing to meet g3, softening white's kingside light squares with queen e7, reinforcing the center. The struggle over e5 continued after knight f3, when Nakamura replied with f6, supporting and unpinning the e5 pawn. We have reached an unusual but positionally complex situation in which black maintains a clear central space advantage, but white exerts serious pressure against this center. White may continue with ideas such as knight c3, attacking the unprotected d5 pawn, with or without first including the move c4. At some point, black may decide to challenge white's bishop with a6, likely claiming the bishop pair at the expense of slightly compromising black's structure. The creative Larsen's opening is filled with these sort of unbalanced positions in which overall positional understanding and experience within these unorthodox positions will likely prove more valuable than concrete memorization. As our introduction to irregular flank openings gravitates closer to the center, we may see the respected English opening with c4. Unlike some of the other flank openings, this is a mainline opening that can be a serious way to play for an opening advantage, the subject of another video. The mirror image of this strong flank pawn opening is the controversial bird's opening with f4. This irregular choice is a provocative opening that is not without its followers. It is significantly more risky than the English opening, as it exposes white's king on the e1 to h4 diagonal. Black has no shortage of promising replies, including the flexible knight f6. c5 invites white to play e4, transposing into an unpopular sideline of the Sicilian defense. The adventurous viewer may be interested in exploring Fromm's gambit with e5, leading to interesting play after f takes e5 and d6, sacrificing a pawn with the idea of gaining a lead in development in order to attack white's somewhat compromised kingside. This is a somewhat risky gambit in response to white's risky opening play, and white also has the additional option of transposing into a king's gambit with e4. Just like the other irregular flank openings, if black would prefer to play solidly and not invest too much time studying these lines that rarely occur in practice, a simple plan is to play d5, turning the game into the Dutch defense with colors reversed. We can see a hybrid between the bird and Larsen's opening with b3, preparing a queenside fianchetto. Knight f6 is a solid response, preparing to play in similar fashion to the main line we're about to introduce. Another strong alternative is bishop g4, discouraging white from playing the natural knight f3, as black is prepared to play bishop takes f3, weakening white's already compromised kingside structure. b3 is certainly a possible choice, although white's most common choice is knight f3. Just like playing against the actual Dutch defense, black's kingside bishop is somewhat restricted by the f-pawn, so it may find a brighter future on the long diagonal after g6. Preparing to play bishop g7 on the next move, white typically decides between one of three Dutch defense structures, e3 and d3, resembling the classical Dutch, e3, d4, and c3, resembling the Stonewall Dutch, or white may decide to play in the style of the most aggressive Dutch defense variation, the Leningrad Dutch, by fianchettoing the light-squared bishop with g3, preparing bishop g2 and castling kingside. A common continuation is bishop g7, activating the dark-squared bishop on the long diagonal, when both sides may complete kingside development after bishop g2, knight f6, followed by both sides castling kingside. We have reached a Leningrad Dutch with colors reversed, so knowledge of the Dutch defense is useful for both sides. In this case, white has an extra tempo compared to the typical Dutch defense, so this is certainly a playable approach worth investigating. As we conclude our introduction to the irregular flank openings, it's worth noting that before playing bishop g7, a creative alternative is c6, reinforcing the center while building a central pawn chain on the light squares, preparing to restrict white's light-squared bishop on the long diagonal after bishop g2. Delaying bishop g7 allows black the additional option of disrupting white's kingside plans with queen b6, preventing white from castling while adding pressure against the b2 pawn. The dark-squared bishop is prepared to gang up on this pawn after bishop g7, creating unpleasant queenside pressure. As we can see, there are no shortage of creative options available when dealing with the regular flank openings. The irregular flank openings can range between completely unsound, psychological attempts to unsettle the opponent to more respectable lines that do not significantly compromise the position itself, intending to simply play chess without relying on concrete opening memorization. Although these openings are less common, as well as generally less challenging than the typical mainline openings, these openings certainly have a right to exist and may prove particularly poisonous if black tries too hard to punish these irregular choices. Simply being aware of these openings eliminates some of the surprise value the unorthodox player may be hoping to achieve, and now you have no shortage of interesting and challenging ideas to explore when encountering unorthodox openings.